The Crown is a currently airing television show created by Peter Morgan, which follows the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, beginning with the last years of her father's life and her marriage to Philip Mountbatten, and ending at some point in the 2000s. At time of recording, season 4 has just been published and has been met with some very harsh criticism of what some people view as an overreach of artistic license, particularly regarding the relationship of Prince Charles and Diana Spencer. A number of reviews have been published over the past couple of weeks calling it dangerous propaganda, fake news, treasonous, all sorts. Just today, things have been taken to an absurd new level, as the Mail on Sunday quoted the actual culture secretary of the actual government, saying that Netflix should include a content warning on The Crown acknowledging it as fiction, in order to avoid it being mistaken for a documentary, I suppose. All of this is very curious, and so I have made a YouTube video about it. About half this video will be responding to criticisms of Season 4 specifically, but before that I want to talk about The Crown's use of artistic license in a more general way. The Crown is good TV, I like watching it. But I tend to think of it as a show which keeps having to come up with new ways of solving a big problem that it has. Each season of The Crown deals with a different period of British and Irish history, though the narrative balance between that history and the personal lives of the royal family varies dramatically from episode to episode, and is sometimes quite a blurred distinction. And after season 1, this becomes quite fraught. Queen Elizabeth's accession and coronation came at a very symbolically resonant time, as the collapsing British Empire emerged out of the Second World War and had to adapt to a very different world. One era ending and another beginning is a very comfortable story to tell, centering the death of one monarch and the crowning of another. Especially one who happens to be a 25-year-old woman, which opens up all sorts of thematic ground for a conflict between tradition and innovation, something season 1 of The Crown is very interested in. But what about the 1960s? What about the 1970s? How does one tie together the moon landing, or the winter of discontent, or Thatcherism with the personal life of an aristocrat? How do you deal with the fact that a lot of really serious stuff happened between 1953 and today, to which the Queen was just as much a passive spectator as the average citizen, against which the fabulous wealth and privilege of the Queen's life might seem jarring or even a little offensive? Because, at the end of the day, putting one family in charge of a whole country is a really bad idea. And everyone in the UK knows this. Even the most die-hard monarchists don't actually want the Queen to be able to dissolve Parliament whenever she wants. In fact, just last year, when the government advised that she do exactly that when Parliament was getting in the way of some things they wanted to do, some people I know were actually quite upset at the thought that the Queen was being dragged down into the indignity of politics. Which is historically interesting. I mean, what is the point of a monarchy like that? I suppose it's a sort of symbol and a connection to the past. And I'll admit the fact that there exists a special person in a special house somewhere who has had regular private meetings with the last 14 prime ministers is compelling on some level. But it is nothing more than that, and it mustn't be. By design, the monarchy does not matter. The moment it matters, it has ceased to function, which makes it a very difficult thing to write a drama about. It's hard to see exactly where the drama comes from, since the stakes are so low and the personality is so obscure. And this is a big problem, so how do you solve it?
The Red Perros, have you a war cry for us, Mum?
No, I told you we're the strong silent type.
The strong silent type.
One solution would be that you put the Queen and the royal family in situations where their inaction has a kind of drama of its own, either because it puts them in a difficult personal situation or as a kind of lens on the drama of history. This former approach is favoured by season 1, which works hard to make Elizabeth and her motivations sympathetic and then puts her in situations where she can't act on them. Like, she wants to support Margaret and Peter Townshend's relationship, but she can't because of tradition. And Margaret herself wants to be an active public figure for the royal family, but she can't because of tradition. This works for a little while, but soon it gets old. For me, the moment it became clear that this idea had run its course was season 2, episode 5, titled Marionettes, where the Queen Mother has a monologue about how the royal family have just become puppets to the public interest or whim, with no real agency of their own.
And so it goes. The stings and bites we suffer, as it slips away. Bit by bit, piece by piece. Our authority, our absolutism, our divine rights.
This idea is powerful when it comes to Elizabeth's inability to support her sister and the sacrifice of her individuality at such a young age. But in this episode, the big tragedy is that they have to shake hands with people. I mean, it's not that bad. The Queen Mother laments how the royal family's authority and absolutism has diminished over time, which is very odd viewing. I mean, are we supposed to sympathise with this idea? The framing would suggest that we are, but that makes no sense. King Edward VIII asserted his authority and absolutism, and he is not one of the good guys of this show. But if we're not supposed to sympathise, then why include this view at all? Maybe because shaking hands with people is actually not all that dramatic a thing, and The Crown's creators are clutching at straws to make it so. Inaction can only be dramatic out of hidden tension for so long. But The Crown has a fallback. My favourite episodes of The Crown focus much more on the history and just use the royal family as a kind of passive lens. There are a few good examples of this, especially in season 1. I really like the episode about the London smog of 1952, and how the show depicts Winston Churchill and Anthony Eden struggling for relevance on the world stage in the early years of the Cold War. In other seasons, The Crown has to work quite hard to draw connections between the royal family and historical events, like depicting the Queen as having a much closer relationship with Jackie Kennedy than she really did, and imagining a kind of competition between the two. But sometimes it really works, like in episode 3 of season 3 titled Aberfan. This episode begins not in a palace, but in a village in Wales, immediately before the landslide there that killed 144 people, many of whom were children. The episode jumps between the disaster on the ground level, the political fallout, and the mounting pressure on the Queen to go to Aberfan and comfort people. At first, she's reluctant to do anything, but more out of helplessness than duty. The elevated status of the monarchy the show has set up to this point suddenly feels very futile in a way that I found impactful. In this episode, the inaction of the royals highlights the story of the disaster rather than being a story in itself. There are too few episodes of The Crown that are like this, in my opinion.
I can do anything better than you.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
A second solution to The Crown's problem is to exaggerate how consequential the royal family and their decisions actually are. You might think this is inconsistent with what the show has already established, that the monarchy is about the responsibility of inaction. And I think you would be right about that. There are a few plot lines in seasons 2 and 3 especially that seem to forget all about this and temporarily assume the royal family is like government officials with serious political influence. Episode 2 of season 3, titled Margaretology, sets up a crisis in the British government seeking a bailout from the United States and Lyndon Johnson's refusal because of Harold Wilson's ambivalence about the Vietnam War. This is quite a predicament, so what do the British government do? Of course, they bring in the Queen. Johnson is invited to visit the royals at Balmoral in the hope that that will change his mind somehow. However, he doesn't reply. But Princess Margaret is in America anyway, so maybe she can convince the president to do Britain a favour. At first, Margaret refuses, but Elizabeth commands her, saying, "What I am asking of you amounts to much more than simply attending a dinner." Of course, this isn't true, but simply attending a dinner, which is exactly what happened in real life, by the way, would be boring. So Margaret goes to the White House and is so charming she manages to single-handedly repair the special relationship and earn special thanks from the Queen and the Prime Minister. This episode also really hammers the idea that Lyndon Johnson feels like he can't escape the memory of Jack Kennedy and has to be indulged more than Jack Kennedy was so as not to hurt his feelings. Like Johnson says he can't possibly spend time with the royal family because he wouldn't understand all of the upper-class etiquette, and the royals would laugh behind his back for not getting it like Jack Kennedy did. Despite the fact that season 2 of The Crown has a whole scene dedicated to laughing at the Kennedys for not following the correct protocol.
Mrs. Kennedy.
Your Grace.
Your Royal Highness.
Mrs. Kennedy.
Good evening, Your Royal Majesty.
Oh, dear.
It's all very strange and completely made up, because this episode isn't really about Johnson or Wilson or a bailout or anything like that. It's about Margaret. All of this is just to put her in a situation where she can shine and be useful, to tease out some drama in her relationship with Elizabeth and with her husband, since she feels overshadowed by Elizabeth and her husband feels overshadowed by her. Johnson's feelings of exclusion from the royal family are invented so as to create a challenge for Margaret to overcome in the story, a challenge which she is uniquely placed to solve, that Elizabeth couldn't solve. So these inaccuracies do have a role, but the role is to enhance the show's characterization, not to make claims about the history itself. That said, I think this episode really undercuts some of the setup of season 1. There, the monarchy is depicted as quite a sinister thing. It takes away your personality and your freedom and makes you cold to everyone else around you, all for the sake of abstract concepts like duty and tradition. And core to this gilded cage depiction is the idea that the monarch is powerless to help people, even people very close to them. I think this is a good story, but it's a story that was completely told by season 1. In trying to come up with something else as the show ages past season 1, episodes like Margaretology depict the royal family as deeply involved in government policy and pivotal to its success, which is ridiculous. This contradiction isn't acknowledged or resolved in The Crown, it just sort of peters out as the show's focus shifts elsewhere. I think this is why season 1 feels so different to seasons 2 and 3, and in another way to season 4.
I got the best
third solution to the Crown's problem, which is increasingly relied upon in later seasons, is to source drama not from the historical significance of the monarchy, but from the interpersonal relationships of the family itself. This is something seasons 1 and 2 tried with Elizabeth and Philip's relationship, and something season 3 tried with Elizabeth and Charles' relationship, with mixed results. Because, at least after the end of season 1, most of the Crown's characters aren't really all that likeable. Except Princess Anne, to be fair. And this can leave the family drama just feeling a bit out of touch and awkward.
If this union is to endure, then we must learn to respect each other's differences. Nobody likes to be ignored, to not be seen, or heard, or listened to.
Well, am I wrong? Isn't there a similarity between my predicament and the Welsh?
No. Those things are quite different. In my opinion, something that this approach in seasons 2 and 3 of The Crown really lack is someone to root for. If you're going to focus on the personalities and relationships of your story, this setup won't do. What you really need is a hero, someone to fall in love with on screen. I believe on some deep level that someone who works for The Crown had a vision of this scene years ago, and the whole show has just been one big excuse to get it produced. I think season 4 is a bit of a burst dam. A lot of ideas that had built up for a long time got their moment in this season, and you can tell. It seems to have really caught people's imaginations in a way that I think the earlier seasons didn't. And it's the strong reaction to this season that has got me so interested in The Crown lately. Because season 4 of The Crown and its use of artistic license, especially in its depiction of Charles and Diana's relationship, has upset a lot of people. A friend of mine recently shared a Guardian article written by Simon Jenkins which expresses some of the reasons why, and I'm going to use that article to structure my thoughts about the topic. Here are some quotes. The Crown has garnered plaudits for its acting and brickbats for its inaccuracies, almost all of them derogatory towards living or recently dead individuals. The new series on Netflix appears to have upped the fabrication and the offence. The scriptwriter Peter Morgan admits sometimes you have to forsake accuracy, but you must never forsake truth. This sounds like a dangerous distinction. Helen Mirren's portrayal of Elizabeth II in The Queen was uncomplimentary, but a plausible recreation of events around the death of Diana. Olivia Colman's sour-faced parody of the monarch on Netflix left us guessing which parts were true and which false. It was fake history. False history is reality hijacked as propaganda. As Morgan implies, his film may not be accurate, but his purpose is to share a deeper truth with his audience. That the royal family were beastly to Diana and out to get her. Will we next be told they really killed her? Most historical novelists go to great lengths to verify their version of events, as Hilary Mantel does. So did Tolstoy in War and Peace. We accept that distant history has time to set its house in order. That is why modern history must be different. It is too close to what should be sacred ground, bearing witness to passing events. Fake history is fake news entrenched. To the legions of global cyber warriors, fakery is legitimate hacking. To the trollers and spinners of lies, to left-wing conspiracy theorists and right-wing vaccine deniers, it is retaliation against power. To documentary makers for whom ordinary facts are not colourful enough, not sufficiently damning, fake history carries the magic trump card. Artistic license. There is a lot here, but if you ignore the bit about global cyber warriors, I think this article makes some interesting claims. 1. That season 4 of The Crown employs artistic license more than the earlier seasons do. 2. That Peter Morgan's film The Queen, published in 2006, uses artistic license less than The Crown does and is more plausible. 3. That The Crown season 4 is motivated by a perception of Diana as an innocent victim of the royal family's mistreatment. And 4. That employing artistic license when writing about recent history is necessarily different to when writing about distant history. I am now going to talk about all of these points one by one. Firstly, that season 4 of The Crown employs artistic license more than the earlier seasons do. I disagree. I have already argued that seasons 1 to 3 of The Crown are very comfortable with embellishing history. Like, does Simon Jenkins think that Prince Charles really does harbour Welsh nationalist sympathies? That the Queen genuinely suspected Harold Wilson of being a Soviet spy? Of course, he doesn't. These stories were just as generous a use of artistic license as the Diana storyline, possibly more so. Jenkins claimed that season 4 is uniquely flexible in its depiction of history as just framing for a completely different point he wants to make. That the use of artistic license in season 4 of The Crown differs from seasons 1 to 3, not in quantity, but in quality. It is uniquely motivated to smear the royal family, of whom Simon Jenkins feels very protective. Which makes sense, I mean they did give him a knighthood. Second, that Peter Morgan's film The Queen, released in 2006, uses artistic license less than The Crown does and is more plausible. I disagree. I am going to play for you now part of the first scene of The Queen.
Of course, one forgets that as sovereign, you're not entitled to vote.
No.
Still, you won't catch me feeling sorry for you. You might not be allowed to vote, ma'am. But it is your government.
Yes. I suppose that is some consolation.
So, does Simon Jenkins think that that conversation really happened? Does he think that Tony Blair really said this to Alastair Campbell?
That woman has given her whole life in service to her people. 50 years doing a job she never wanted. A job she watched kill her father. She's executed it with honour, dignity, and, as far as I can tell, without a single blemish, and now we're all baying for her blood. All because she's struggling to lead the world in mourning for someone who threw everything she offered back in her face.
Of course, he doesn't. What Jenkins perceives as plausibility is just the employment of artistic license in favour of his judgments and feelings about the royal family. That's really my point made, but I'm going to go on a tangent for a few minutes now, because The Queen is a fascinatingly weird movie. I can't be sure about this, but there's something about The Queen that feels kind of contrarian, as if most people in 2006 were convinced that the Queen was a horrible person and Diana was a saint, and the film is trying to push an alternative view. Simon Jenkins mentions in his article that Helen Mirren's depiction of the Queen was uncomplimentary, which I really don't understand. What Jenkins might be remembering is that the other members of the royal family are depicted very critically. Prince Charles is self-pitying and entitled, Elizabeth the Queen Mother and Prince Philip are bullish and judgmental, Princess Margaret doesn't actually appear, but is quoted as saying something horrible about Diana. But this isn't just limited to them. Pretty much everyone in this film is fickle and cynical and mean-spirited. Except Tony Blair and the Queen. These two personalities are so flawless that it's slightly surreal. Like there are these humble, patriotic souls just trying to do the right thing, and everyone else in Britain is a horrible person. In the film's latter half, there's this strange symbolism of a stag which is wounded by a commercial guest to an estate that borders the royal family's land, something that also happens in season 4 of The Crown. In The Queen, the estate hunts down and kills the stag to put it out of its misery, and Elizabeth visits its hanging corpse, having sort of bonded with it earlier on. I think the idea here is that she's mourning the death of something, and we're being invited to do the same. But the death of what? I think the death of whatever this is.
I doubt there is anyone who knows the British people more than I do, Mr. Blair, nor who has greater faith in their wisdom and judgment. And it is my belief that they will any moment reject this mood, which is being stirred up by the press, in favour of a period of restrained grief and sober private mourning. That's the way we do things in this country. Quietly, with dignity.
Make of that what you will. By the way, in season 4 of The Crown, it's Diana who shoots and kills the wounded stag. Generally speaking, the Queen is enormously sympathetic to Elizabeth and subtly very critical of Diana, which makes it interesting that The Queen and The Crown were written by the same person. This also seems to completely sink the strange paranoid idea that a number of outlets have attributed to an anonymous associate of Prince Charles, that The Crown is propaganda, knowingly trying to hurt Prince Charles' reputation as an end in itself. If Peter Morgan were a devout Republican who was out to get the monarchy, he would not have written a film like The Queen. Also, if someone were to get their politics from The Crown, I don't think it would be the Diana storyline that clinched it for republicanism. Like, season 2 spent quite a lot of time depicting the deep ties between the British aristocracy and the Nazis. If that's left you on the fence about the monarchy, season 4 is not going to convince you of anything. It's quite probable that Peter Morgan isn't a Republican or a monarchist, he's just a screenwriter. He, and plenty of others who worked on both of these productions, just want to tell stories that people will enjoy watching. In 2006, that story was The Queen. In 2020, that story is The Crown. It'll be worth doing a much more in-depth look at this when The Crown reaches the same time period as The Queen, and I wonder how well my comparison here will hold up then. Next up, The Crown Season 4 is motivated by a perception of Diana as an innocent victim of the royal family's mistreatment. I agree. Diana is the sort of unspoken main character of Season 4. I said earlier that many of The Crown's characters aren't particularly likeable, and Diana has quite an impact on this. I think in Diana, the show's creators found a way to vent a lot of the frustrations that had built up with the other characters up to this point. Charles was never depicted as a flawless personality in seasons 1 to 3, but in season 4 he takes on a level of real malice which feels quite sudden. Contrastingly, everything about Diana is cast in a sympathetic light, even her extramarital relationship, and Emma Corrin's attention to detail in her performance makes Diana's personality feel vivid and genuinely refreshing, compared to which Charles just seems bitter.
You think we couldn't do that too? Theatrically hug the wretched and the dispossessed and cover ourselves in glory all over the front pages?
I doubt it. You barely find it in yourselves to hug your own.
I hug who I want to.
And it's clear that the show is comfortable with embellishing historical events in order to stress this narrative. Obviously, the private conversations between Charles and Diana are fabricated, but there are other cases which were less necessary. In Diana and Charles' real-life engagement interview, when the interviewer said that they were in love and Charles replied, "Whatever love means," Diana reacted quite differently in the actual footage than how it's depicted in The Crown.
And I suppose in love.
Of course.
Whatever in love means.
Yes.
You both look very much in love.
Oh, yes. Absolutely.
Whatever in love means.
Now, this was still a really weird thing to say, and I'm not saying that Charles never did anything wrong and The Crown is deliberately trying to misrepresent him, which I think Jenkins might be. Just that I think season 4 found the hero it so desperately needed in Diana, and it found a villain in Charles. And if the ending shot of episode 10 tells us anything, it's that this will continue into season 5. Finally, that employing artistic license when writing about recent history is necessarily different to when writing about distant history. Now, this is a really interesting one. And on the surface, I think it's just not true. I agree that artistic license could be used in historical drama in an irresponsible way, but I think there are much better metrics for this than whether the history in question is recent or distant. There are plenty of distant historical periods that I would argue require special care when using artistic license, which I would consider sacred ground in Jenkins' words. It's also strange to me that he cites War and Peace to back up his point here. The gap in time between the Napoleonic Wars and War and Peace being written isn't that much longer than that between Charles and Diana's relationship and season 4 of The Crown. And Leo Tolstoy clearly wasn't sticking to the strict evidence-based historical record. I mean, Napoleon himself has a prominent speaking role in this novel. My point is, this has nothing to do with proximity and everything to do with judgment. What I think Jenkins works hard to avoid in this article is explaining exactly why the topics of season 4 are sacred ground to him. Season 4 of The Crown isn't more historically inaccurate than the other seasons, and it isn't qualitatively different because it's handling more recent history. It just feels different to you because you care about what it's representing. You care about Prince Charles and you don't want to think he's a bad person, and you care about the Queen. What I don't get is, why not just say that? Why be so shy about it? The people I know who love Diana just say that they love Diana, and they say that they love season 4 of The Crown because they love Diana in it. But the people who love the royal family and really, really did not like season 4 of The Crown seem much less able to call those feelings what they are. When I put myself in that position, I imagined that the sacred ground case would be quite hard to argue. You can't claim that the royal family is sacred because of their political role, because their political role is to do nothing. You also can't claim that the royal family is sacred because of their character and values, because so little is actually known about those two things, and what is known is fairly mixed. Really, the only way to say the royal family is sacred is just to say it. There's no reason for it, it's just true. They exist, and they are sacred because they exist. The Crown is sacrilege because it exists. I think I've probably focused a bit too much on this article. I just found it very thought-provoking. The Crown is not fake history or propaganda. Like The Queen and other things Peter Morgan has written, it is a fiction which is required by its own premise to use artistic license to fill enormous narrative gaps. It's a historical drama. It uses history, or a reading of history, to tell a story worth telling. And that's all it's trying to do. The Crown's most passionate critics are struggling with the same problem that the Crown itself struggles with. Why should we care? Why do we care? I think this is an interesting creative challenge, and I enjoy the results.
Anyone who's been to the Jewel House at the Tower of London will know there are several crowns to be seen there, but only 2 of them are actually used. The St. Edward's crown and this one,